ever wonder what makes some stories just resonate? Like why some stories immediately become so memorable and so successful, and others just don't? In the past, I've heard people talking about things like this, and they tend to say, oh, it's just luck, the stars are aligning, and sometimes everything just comes together. No, guys, no. There's always a reason. There's always a logical, measurable reason for success. The reason that people say things like that is because they really just don't know what the reason is. They can't see it, or maybe it's non-tangible, so it's hard to quantify, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a reason. I used to think this too when I was first starting out as a writer. I used to wonder what made stories so epic. I didn't always have the correct lingo to really express what I meant, but I always thought of it in terms of an epic story. I remember thinking that I wanted to write epic stories, like the epic stories that I loved to read, right? And really, I was tapping into the reason that readers really do read stories, but I just didn't know how to express exactly what I meant back then. So let's get into it. Why do readers read fiction? Like, what are the reasons that they actually purchase fiction? Okay, your answer or answers most likely fall under one of what I call the 4 E's: education, enlightenment, entertainment, or escapism. And none of those answers are incorrect by any means, but I want you to go a little higher level than that, because technically readers could get any of those things, meaning education, enlightenment, escapism, entertainment, from other activities. They could get it from hanging out with their friends or playing miniature golf or whatever it is that they might do for fun, right? So why are they specifically reading fiction in order to experience those things? Well, here it is. I'm going to tell you. Lean in, because this is probably going to blow your mind a little bit. Readers read fiction in order to feel big emotions in a safe space. I'm going to say that again. Readers read fiction in order to feel big emotions in a safe space. Our fast-paced, instant gratification society does not hold space for big emotions, does it? Quite the opposite, in fact. We are taught to repress them, to tamp them down, to not express them, and even to not feel them. But fiction has this unique capability to help us feel our emotions. Before we go any further, guys, make sure and give me a thumbs up and a subscribe so that you don't miss any future writing tips, okay? From an emotional health standpoint, human beings are meant to feel their emotions potently, process their emotions, which is just a fancy way of saying create meaning from those emotions, and then release them. But none of us are taught to do this, are we? We weren't taught by our parents, and they weren't taught by their parents, and on back. So none of us actually knows how to do this. But then I want you to think about the experience of reading a well-written book. We ride along with the characters, we feel their emotions, we go on their journey with them, and right around the climactic part of the story, we experience a catharsis. And catharsis doesn't just mean feeling emotions, it means releasing emotions. That's what the definition is. It's an emotional release. And the reason that creates so much satisfaction for the reader is because human beings yearn to feel their emotions. We yearn to feel those big emotions. We want to, and we are denied that in most parts of our lives. So what does all of this psychology about emotion mean for you, the author of your fiction story? It means that it's your job to infuse every part of your story with as much emotion as you can pack into it. Now, maybe you think that's obvious, but let's talk about what infusing your story with emotion actually means. Because how you're defining that, it may not be incorrect, but it's only one aspect of how to infuse your story with emotion. Making your story emotional does not just mean making your characters more emotional or throwing in more emotionally devastating plot events. Those are 2 ways to up the emotional ante for sure, but they aren't the only ways, and they're not even the most effective ways. What I'm talking about here has less to do with the story itself, less to do with the characters and the plot, and more to do with the reader. I'm talking about crafting your story based on psychology. Yes, story psychology, reader psychology, and human psychology. See, all readers absorb and process story in exactly the same way. If you can craft your story in a way that works with rather than against the reader's natural enjoyment of story, they'll experience the emotion of your story on a much higher level than if you don't. And I got more news for you. No story ever hit it big ever became a beloved bestseller or mainstream phenomenon unless it was very heavy on the emotions it made readers feel. So, you want to succeed as a fiction author? You have to master your story craft, which is synonymous with saying you have to master the emotion in your story. Not only what it is, but how to communicate it on the page to the reader. Every single thing that we all point to as weaknesses in our writing, from flat characters to a stale plot, even to editing, can be traced back to the emotion it makes a reader feel or the lack thereof. So if your characters are flat, the readers are not going to feel the catharsis. If your plot meanders all over the place, they don't feel the emotions of the journey and they're going to put down the book. If your manuscript is full of passive voice, they have a really hard time connecting with the sentence structure, and that makes it hard for them to stay in the story because they're not connecting with the emotion of the sentences and the words. Even when it comes to word choice, things like typos. Yes, it's a problem. It pulls them out of the story, but why? Because you're interrupting the emotion when there's a typo there. It's like hitting a wall and they get jerked right out of the story, but it's because you're interrupting the emotional flow of the story with that typo. See what I mean? And it's funny because every time I teach this, whether it's online or in a room full of people, I always have at least one author come up to me and say, "That was mind-blowing. No one's ever told me that before." Now, don't get me wrong. I think this is something that most authors intuitively know, but it's something that we don't speak about or think about consciously. It's not something we teach. So the reason that it's resonating so heavily with authors is because it's simply the truth. We all hear it and then go, yeah, that's totally it, right? That is what makes stories resonate. It's the emotion. That is what makes stories resonate. But now you know, which means it's your responsibility to yourself and to your readers to make the stories you tell as emotional as possible. That's how you write great stories. That's how your stories become bestsellers. That's how you serve your readers. It's even how you create satisfaction for yourself in writing the story. So let's talk about that for a minute. If you've gotten bored with your story, if it feels like it's dragging and you're just not excited to write it anymore, it's because you've lost the emotion of the story. And come on, we've all experienced this before, right? A story starts to drag. We're just not as excited to write it as we once were. So when we sit down, nothing happens. We don't get any words out. But then we either come up with something new that we didn't have for the story before, or maybe we just write a really juicy scene and boom, we're immediately excited about the story again. You know, it reinvigorates it, gives it new life. Why does that happen? Because you just tapped back into the emotion of the story. And it's totally possible to do this intentionally. It's totally possible to know exactly how to tap back into the emotions of your story so that when it goes a little stale on you, you can just fix that. I do it all the time and can teach you how. But the point is, it's emotion that makes you want to write your stories. It's emotion that makes the reader want to read your stories. It's the emotion more than anything else, no matter what the marketers say, that turns your story into a bestseller and a timeless classic. It's the emotional experience that the reader is looking for and that will make them come back to you time and time again to buy everything you ever publish because they know that you will give them that cathartic experience no matter what the story is. So let's go back to the first question I asked. Do you ever wonder what is it that makes some stories just resonate, that makes them timeless, that makes them beloved, that makes people go back to them again and again and gush over them and be huge fans of that story and that author? Answer, it is the emotion. And learning to infuse your stories with emotion is an art and a skill that absolutely can be learned.